In the marble corridors of Valdoria Palace, where whispered secrets echo louder than royal proclamations, loyalty has a price, and betrayal wears a crown. When Captain Marcus Thorne discovered what lurked beneath the silkened ceremony, he realized that protecting the throne meant more than standing guard, it meant choosing between duty and truth. Captain Marcus Thorne had served the royal guard of Valdoria for 15 years, but he had never felt the weight of his ceremonial sword quite like this. The ornate blade, passed down through generations of palace guardsmen, seemed heavier tonight as he made his rounds through the east wing of the palace. The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows, creating shadows that danced across the marble floors like restless spirits. It was well past midnight when Marcus noticed the faint glow emanating from beneath the door of the Queen Dowager's private study. Queen Isabella had passed away 6 months ago, and the room had remained sealed since then, per the new Queen's orders. Lady Camilla Rothschild, the late Queen's most trusted advisor and closest confidant, should have had no business being there at this hour, or any hour, for that matter. Marcus approached the heavy oak door with practiced silence. His leather boots made no sound against the Persian carpet that had once welcomed visiting dignitaries and foreign ambassadors. Through the keyhole, he could see Lady Camilla hunched over an ornate chest that Marcus recognized immediately. It was the Queen Dowager's personal jewelry collection, a treasure trove that had been the subject of much speculation since Isabella's death. Lady Camilla Rothschild was not just any courtier. She had been Queen Isabella's right hand for over 2 decades, managing everything from state dinners to private correspondence. Her influence had been so profound that many whispered she was the real power behind the throne during the Queen Dowager's final years. She was a woman of striking elegance, with silver hair that she wore in an impeccable chignon and eyes that seemed to see through every facade. At 62, she moved with the grace of someone who had navigated the treacherous waters of court politics for most of her adult life. But what Marcus saw through that keyhole shattered every assumption he had about the woman's character. Camilla's usually steady hands trembled slightly as she lifted a magnificent sapphire necklace from the chest. The Tears of Valdoria, as it was known, had been in the royal family for over 3 centuries. Legend held that it had been a gift from a Moorish prince to Queen Isabella's ancestor, and it was said to bring protection to whoever wore it. The deep blue stones caught the lamplight and threw it back in brilliant flashes, creating an almost hypnotic display. Marcus watched, transfixed, as Camilla carefully wrapped the necklace in black velvet before placing it into a leather satchel that sat open on the Queen Dowager's writing desk. But the necklace was just the beginning. One by one, she began removing other pieces from the collection: the diamond tiara of storms, the emerald bracelet of St. Catherine, and the ruby ring of benediction. Each piece represented not just monetary value, but centuries of royal history and tradition. The captain's mind raced. This wasn't simple theft, this was systematic dismantling of the royal heritage. But why would Lady Camilla, who had been so devoted to Queen Isabella, risk everything for these jewels? She was wealthy in her own right, having inherited substantial estates from her late husband, Lord Edmund Rothschild. The financial motive didn't make sense. As he continued to observe, Marcus noticed something else troubling. Camilla wasn't working alone. Every few minutes, she would glance toward a side door that led to the palace's service corridors. Someone was clearly standing watch, though Marcus couldn't see who from his vantage point. The operation was planned and coordinated, suggesting a conspiracy that extended beyond a single person's greed. The sound of approaching footsteps in the main corridor forced Marcus to step back from the door. He quickly moved to a shadowed alcove, pressing himself against the cold stone wall as 2 palace servants hurried past, their arms full of linens. They were heading toward the guest quarters, probably preparing for the arrival of dignitaries expected for the upcoming autumn festival. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. While the palace buzzed with preparations for a celebration of royal tradition, someone was systematically stealing the very symbols of that heritage. When the servants disappeared around a corner, Marcus returned to his surveillance. Through the keyhole, he could see that Camilla had nearly finished her work. The leather satchel was now bulging with wrapped treasures, and she was carefully closing the ornate chest. But something had changed in her demeanor. Where before she had worked with the methodical precision of someone following a well-rehearsed plan, now she seemed agitated, constantly checking a small pocket watch that hung from a chain around her neck. Marcus realized she was working against a deadline. The side door suddenly opened, and Marcus caught a glimpse of a figure in dark clothing before Camilla quickly extinguished the lamp. The room plunged into darkness, and Marcus heard whispered voices, though he couldn't make out the words. The conversation was brief and urgent. Then, he heard the soft click of the main door's lock being turned from the inside. Marcus had seconds to decide his next move. He could confront them immediately, but, without backup and uncertain about how many conspirators were involved, that could be dangerous. Alternatively, he could follow them and try to uncover the full extent of the plot. But, if he let them leave with the jewels, they might disappear forever, taking with them irreplaceable pieces of Valdoria's history. The decision was made for him when he heard the distinctive creak of the secret passage that connected the Queen Dowager's study to the old servants' quarters. Marcus knew about the passage, all senior guards did, but it had been sealed years ago after security concerns. Someone had clearly reopened it. Moving quickly but quietly, Marcus made his way through the palace corridors toward the servants' quarters. The route would take him past the kitchen, through the stable yards, and into the older section of the palace where the passage emerged. If he hurried, he might be able to intercept them. The palace at night was a different world from the bustling center of government it became during the day. Shadows seemed deeper, sounds carried farther, and every creak of the old building felt amplified. Marcus had walked these halls countless times, but tonight they felt alien, as if the very stones were aware of the treachery unfolding within their embrace. As he passed through the kitchen, Marcus grabbed a small hand lantern, keeping its flame low. The cook's quarters were empty, the staff wouldn't begin preparations for the morning meal for another few hours. The silence was broken only by the steady tick of the great clock in the main hall, marking time like a heartbeat in the darkness. The stable yards were shrouded in mist from the earlier rain. Marcus could smell the horses and hear their occasional snorts and movements. But there was something else, the sound of wheels on cobblestones, moving slowly and deliberately. A carriage was being prepared, but, at this hour, no legitimate palace business would require such transportation. Marcus positioned himself behind a stone pillar that provided a view of both the stable entrance and the old servants' entrance where the secret passage emerged. He didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, he saw a dim light moving within the old building, growing brighter as it approached the exit. Lady Camilla emerged first, still carrying the leather satchel. But Marcus was shocked to see her companion, Thomas Aldridge, the palace's head of security. Aldridge was a man Marcus had respected and worked alongside for over a decade. He was known for his unwavering loyalty to the crown and his meticulous attention to detail. To see him involved in this theft felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any blade. The two conspirators moved quickly toward a plain black carriage that waited in the shadows. The driver's face was hidden beneath a hood, but Marcus could see enough to know it wasn't anyone from the palace staff. This was clearly an outsider, brought in specifically for this operation. As they loaded the satchel into the carriage, Marcus heard fragments of their conversation carried on the night wind. Aldridge was speaking in urgent, clipped tones about the timeline being moved up and ensuring the shipment reaches the coast before dawn. Lady Camilla responded with something about the buyer's patience wearing thin and too much at stake to delay further. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place in Marcus's mind. This wasn't a simple theft, it was part of a larger smuggling operation. The royal jewels were being sold, probably to private collectors or foreign agents who would pay handsomely for pieces of Valdoria's heritage. The involvement of Thomas Aldridge explained how the conspirators had been able to access secured areas and operate without detection. But questions remained. How long had this been going on? Were these the only items being stolen, or was this part of a systematic looting of the palace's treasures? And, most importantly, who was the buyer that commanded such urgency and risk? The carriage began to move, its wheels crunching softly on the wet gravel. Marcus had to make his choice now. He could raise the alarm and have the palace guards mobilized to stop the carriage before it left the grounds. But doing so would mean revealing his surveillance and potentially alerting other conspirators who might still be within the palace. The smarter play might be to follow the carriage and see where it led, gathering intelligence that could expose the entire network. Marcus chose to follow. He quickly made his way to the guardhouse where the patrol horses were kept. As a senior guard, he had access at any hour. He selected Storm, a reliable gray mare known for her sure footing and quiet temperament. Within minutes, he was following the carriage at a discreet distance, using his knowledge of the local roads to anticipate their route. The carriage headed east, toward the port city of Marisol. It was a logical destination. The port had enough traffic that a small shipment could easily be lost among the legitimate cargo, and there were regular ships departing for destinations throughout Europe and beyond. If the jewels made it onto a ship, recovering them would become exponentially more difficult. As Marcus followed through the winding country roads, his mind turned to the implications of what he had discovered. Lady Camilla's betrayal was shocking enough, but Thomas Aldridge's involvement suggested the corruption extended into the very heart of the palace security apparatus. How many others might be involved? Were there other thefts that had gone unnoticed? And what would this revelation mean for the new queen, who had only recently ascended to the throne and was still establishing her authority? The rain began to fall again, creating a rhythmic drumming on the leaves of the oak trees that lined the road. Marcus pulled his cloak tighter and urged Storm forward, maintaining his careful distance behind the carriage. The stakes were higher than just recovering stolen property. The very integrity of the monarchy was at risk. As they approached the outskirts of Marisol, the carriage began to slow. Marcus guided Storm off the main road and into a grove of trees that provided cover while still allowing him to observe. The port city spread out below them, its lights twinkling like earthbound stars in the pre-dawn darkness. Somewhere in those narrow streets and busy docks, a transaction was about to take place that would send pieces of Valdoria's history into foreign hands forever. But Marcus Thorne, captain of the Royal Guard, was not about to let that happen without a fight. The carriage wound its way through the cobblestone streets of Marisol, moving with the careful precision of those familiar with their destination. Marcus dismounted Storm and tied her to a post near an abandoned warehouse, then continued on foot through the maze of narrow alleys that characterized the old port district. The smell of salt air mixed with the less pleasant odors of fish, tar, and unwashed humanity that seemed to permeate every coastal trading center. Marisol had been Valdoria's primary port for over 2 centuries, and its importance to the kingdom's economy made it a place where questions were rarely asked and suspicious activities often went unnoticed. The constant flow of merchants, sailors, and cargo created perfect cover for illicit operations. Marcus realized this probably wasn't the first time these ancient streets had witnessed the smuggling of royal treasures. The carriage came to a stop outside the Seahorse Tavern, an establishment that Marcus knew by reputation if not personal experience. It catered to a clientele that preferred anonymity: ship captains who didn't ask questions about their cargo, merchants who dealt in goods of questionable provenance, and information brokers who sold secrets to the highest bidder. The perfect place for a clandestine transaction. From his position in a shadowed doorway across the street, Marcus watched as Lady Camilla and Thomas Aldridge emerged from the carriage. Both had changed their clothing during the journey. Gone were Camilla's elegant court dress and Aldridge's palace uniform. Instead, they wore the simple, dark garments of middle-class merchants, the kind of people who might legitimately have business at the docks in the pre-dawn hours. The transformation was remarkable. Lady Camilla, who normally carried herself with the regal bearing of someone accustomed to palace life, now hunched her shoulders slightly and walked with the hurried gait of a nervous trader. Aldridge had pulled a woolen cap low over his face, obscuring his distinctive features. These were not amateur criminals fumbling through their first theft, they were experienced operatives who had clearly done this before. They retrieved the leather satchel from the carriage and disappeared into the tavern. Marcus waited several minutes before following, knowing that entering too soon after them would risk exposure. When he finally pushed open the tavern's heavy wooden door, he was greeted by the typical scene of a port establishment in the early hours: a handful of sailors nursing tankards of ale, a card game in progress at a corner table, and the tavern keeper wiping down glasses with practiced indifference to his customers' business. Marcus spotted his quarry immediately. They were seated at a table near the back of the room, engaged in conversation with a man whose appearance immediately marked him as foreign. He was tall and lean, with the olive complexion and dark hair characteristic of the southern Mediterranean regions. His clothes were well made but not ostentatious, the garb of a successful merchant who could afford quality but chose not to display his wealth too obviously. The stranger spoke in accented English, his voice carrying the musical cadence of Italian or perhaps Spanish. Marcus couldn't hear the complete conversation from his position at the bar, but he caught fragments that painted a disturbing picture. The man was clearly the buyer, and he was not pleased with delays in the delivery schedule. References to other collectors and alternative sources suggested that Valdoria's royal treasures were just one part of a larger black market network dealing in stolen cultural artifacts. Marcus ordered a tankard of ale and tried to position himself closer to their table without drawing attention. The tavern's dim lighting and smoky atmosphere provided good cover, but he had to be careful. Both Camilla and Aldridge would recognize him instantly if they got a clear look at his face. As he nursed his drink, Marcus was able to piece together more of the conversation. The foreign buyer was expressing concerns about increased security at various European palaces, suggesting that their operation was international in scope. There were mentions of artifacts from France, Austria, and the German states, a criminal network that trafficked in the heritage of multiple kingdoms. The satchel containing the Valdorian jewels sat on the table between them, but Marcus noticed something troubling. The buyer seemed to be expecting more items than what the satchel contained. Lady Camilla was explaining, in hushed tones, about complications at the palace and the need to accelerate the timeline. It became clear that this particular shipment was meant to be much larger. Aldridge leaned forward, his voice barely audible above the tavern's ambient noise, and said something that made Marcus's blood run cold. There were plans for additional thefts, targeting not just the remaining jewelry collection but also historical documents and rare artifacts from the palace archives. The scope of the conspiracy was far beyond anything Marcus had imagined. The buyer produced a leather pouch from beneath his coat, and Marcus could hear the distinctive sound of gold coins as it was placed on the table. The payment was substantial, more money than most people would see in a lifetime. It explained how the conspirators had been able to operate with such sophistication and resources. As the transaction neared completion, Marcus realized he faced a critical decision. He could attempt to arrest them now, but he was outnumbered and in unfamiliar territory. The tavern's other patrons would likely not intervene to help a palace guard, and some might even actively assist the criminals if they thought it would benefit them. Alternatively, he could follow the buyer and try to identify his ship, potentially uncovering the entire smuggling network. The decision was made for him when he overheard Aldridge mention the next planned theft. It was scheduled for the following evening during the autumn festival, when the palace would be filled with guests and the security staff stretched thin managing the crowds. They intended to target the Crown Archive, where the kingdom's most precious historical documents were kept, including the original charter that had established the royal line of succession. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. Those documents weren't just valuable, they were the legal foundation of the monarchy itself. In the wrong hands, they could be used to challenge the legitimacy of the current royal line or to forge claims by pretenders to the throne. The theft of jewelry was criminal. The theft of those documents was treasonous. The meeting concluded with handshakes and the discreet exchange of items. The buyer took possession of the satchel while Lady Camilla secured the payment pouch in her coat. But, before parting, the foreign merchant made one final comment that struck Marcus like a physical blow. There were already buyers lined up for the documents from the Crown Archive, buyers willing to pay prices that would make this transaction look like pocket change. Marcus watched as the three criminals left the tavern separately. The buyer headed toward the docks, while Lady Camilla and Thomas Aldridge made their way back to their carriage. Marcus had to choose which lead to follow, and, after a moment's consideration, he decided to track the buyer. Understanding the smuggling network might be the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy. The docks of Marisol were already coming to life as dawn approached. Fishermen were preparing their nets for the day's work, merchants were checking cargo manifests, and ship crews were beginning the complex process of loading and unloading vessels. The buyer moved through this organized chaos with the confidence of someone who belonged, greeting several people with familiar nods. He eventually approached a sleek merchant vessel flying the flag of the Italian city-states. The ship was clearly built for speed rather than cargo capacity, the kind of vessel that could outrun customs officials or naval patrols if necessary. Marcus noted the ship's name, the Stella Maris, and tried to memorize as many details as possible about its appearance and crew. The buyer boarded the ship and disappeared into the captain's cabin. Within minutes, there was a flurry of activity as the crew began preparing for immediate departure. Marcus realized that the Stella Maris would be gone before the palace authorities could be alerted, taking the stolen jewels beyond the reach of Valdorian law. But something unexpected happened. Instead of setting sail immediately, the ship remained docked. Marcus observed from behind a stack of cargo crates as additional visitors arrived throughout the morning. Each carried small packages or satchels, and all were welcomed aboard by the mysterious buyer. It became clear that the Stella Maris was serving as a floating warehouse, collecting stolen artifacts from multiple sources before departing for its final destination. This presented Marcus with an opportunity, but also increased the danger. If he could gather enough evidence about the ship and its cargo, he might be able to provide the authorities with everything they needed to pursue the matter through diplomatic channels even after the vessel left Valdorian waters. However, getting close enough to gather such evidence would require considerable risk. As the morning progressed, Marcus watched a parade of suspicious characters visit the ship. There was a nervous-looking clerk who might have been selling access to government documents, a well-dressed woman who could have been trafficking in stolen artwork, and several rough-looking men who had the appearance of professional thieves. The Stella Maris was clearly the hub of a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond the theft of royal jewels. Around midday, Marcus noticed increased activity around the ship as the crew began final preparations for departure. The tide would be turning soon, and sailing conditions would be optimal for a vessel seeking to leave port quickly and quietly. If he was going to act, it had to be now. Marcus made his way closer to the ship, using the busy dock activity as cover. Longshoremen were loading cargo onto nearby vessels, creating enough noise and movement to mask his approach. He managed to get close enough to hear conversations on the ship's deck, and what he learned filled him with dread. The buyer was speaking with the ship's captain about their next destination, not just any port, but a specific location where representatives of foreign powers were waiting to purchase Valdorian artifacts. The jewels stolen from Queen Isabella's collection were destined for the private museum of a rival kingdom's prince, where they would be displayed as trophies of Valdoria's weakness and corruption. But, worse than the destination was the timeline. The captain mentioned that they needed to return to Marisol within a fortnight to collect the big shipment, clearly referring to the planned theft of documents from the Crown Archive. The stolen papers would then be transported to buyers who intended to use them to destabilize Valdoria's government and potentially support a claim to the throne by an exiled pretender. Marcus realized he was witnessing more than just criminal activity. This was the beginning of a plot against the kingdom itself. The thefts were not random acts of greed but carefully orchestrated moves in a larger game of international politics and dynastic intrigue. As he crouched behind a pile of rope, frantically trying to memorize every detail he could observe, Marcus heard footsteps approaching his hiding spot. Someone had noticed his prolonged presence in the area. He turned to see one of the ship's crew members walking toward him with the purposeful stride of someone investigating a potential threat. Marcus had seconds to decide his next move. He could try to bluff his way out, claiming to be a dock worker or merchant, but his palace guard bearing might give him away. He could attempt to fight or flee, but either option would alert the criminals to his surveillance and potentially compromise any future investigation. Instead, he chose a third option. As the crew member approached, Marcus stood up boldly and walked directly toward the ship's gangplank, carrying himself with the confident authority of someone who had every right to be there. Sometimes the best disguise was no disguise at all. "Ahoy the Stella Maris," he called out in the traditional sailor's greeting. "I have a message for your passenger from the lady who visited earlier." The crew member paused, uncertain. Marcus had gambled that Lady Camilla might have left instructions or messages, and the hesitation in the sailor's response suggested he had guessed correctly. But before the man could respond, a voice called out from the ship's deck, the voice of the foreign buyer, speaking in rapid Italian to someone Marcus couldn't see. Whatever was said, it galvanized the crew into immediate action. The gangplank was quickly pulled up, mooring lines were cast off, and orders were shouted for immediate departure. Marcus's presence had been noted and identified as a threat. As the Stella Maris began to move away from the dock, Marcus caught a final glimpse of the foreign buyer standing at the ship's rail. The man was staring directly at him with an expression of cold calculation. Their eyes met for a moment, and Marcus saw recognition there, not of his face, but of what he represented. the buyer knew that their operation had been discovered by the palace authorities. The ship gathered speed as it moved toward the harbor entrance, carrying with it the stolen treasures of Valdoria and the secrets that could unravel the entire conspiracy. But Marcus had learned enough to understand the true scope of the threat facing his kingdom. This was not just about recovering stolen jewelry, it was about preventing a plot that could destroy the monarchy itself. As he watched the Stella Maris disappear beyond the harbor mouth, Marcus began planning his next moves. He had evidence of treason and international conspiracy, but he also knew that time was running out. The planned theft from the Crown Archive was only hours away, and the conspirators now knew that their activities had been discovered. The race to save Valdoria's heritage and, perhaps its very survival as an independent kingdom, was about to begin in earnest. Marcus rode storm hard on the return journey to the palace, his mind racing faster than the horse's hooves against the muddy road. The morning sun climbed steadily in the sky, marking each passing hour as precious time lost in his race against the conspirators. The autumn festival would begin at sunset, and, with it, the planned assault on the Crown Archive. As the palace towers came into view, Marcus was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth: he couldn't trust anyone within the royal household until he determined the full extent of the conspiracy. Thomas Aldridge's involvement proved that the corruption reached into the highest levels of palace security, and there might be others. Acting on incomplete information could warn additional conspirators or, worse, put the evidence he had gathered at risk. Marcus decided his first priority must be protecting the Crown Archive, even if it meant acting alone. The ancient documents housed there represented more than historical artifacts, they were the legal and spiritual foundation of Valdoria's monarchy. Their theft would not only rob the kingdom of its heritage but could potentially provide ammunition for any rival claimant to challenge the current royal line. He stabled Storm and made his way through the palace's service corridors, avoiding the main halls where he might encounter Aldridge or other potentially compromised staff members. The festival preparations were already well underway, with servants hurrying through the passages carrying decorations, musicians testing their instruments in distant chambers, and kitchen staff preparing the elaborate feast that would cap the evening's celebrations. The activity provided perfect cover for Marcus's movements, but it also reminded him how vulnerable the palace would be during the festival. With hundreds of guests expected, including foreign dignitaries and nobility from throughout the kingdom, the normal security protocols would be stretched to their limits. The conspirators had chosen their timing brilliantly. Marcus made his way to the Crown Archive, located in the oldest section of the palace. The chamber was protected by massive oak doors reinforced with iron bands, and access was normally restricted to a handful of senior officials. The current locks had been installed during King Ferdinand's reign, over 50 years ago, and were considered impregnable by the standards of their time. But, as Marcus examined the entrance, he noticed subtle signs that someone had been studying the security arrangements. There were fresh scratches around the lock mechanism, barely visible unless one knew what to look for. Small marks on the stone floor suggested that the area had been measured, possibly to plan the positioning of tools or equipment. The conspirators had been preparing for this theft far longer than Marcus had initially realized. Inside the archive, Marcus found himself surrounded by the accumulated wisdom and legal heritage of centuries. Shelf after shelf held documents that chronicled the rise of Valdoria from a small mountain principality to a significant European kingdom. There were treaties with neighboring powers, records of royal marriages that had shaped diplomatic alliances, and, most crucially, the succession documents that established the legitimate line of inheritance. Marcus located the most sensitive materials, including the original charter of succession signed by the first king of Valdoria over 4 centuries ago. The document was written in Latin on vellum, with elaborate illuminated borders and the great seal of the realm pressed into red wax. In the wrong hands, it could be forged or altered to support false claims to the throne. Working quickly, Marcus began identifying the documents that would be most valuable to foreign conspirators or rival claimants. He carefully moved the most critical pieces to a hidden compartment behind a false wall, a secret chamber that even Thomas Aldridge didn't know about. It was a precaution that might buy precious time if the thieves succeeded in breaching the main archive. As he worked, Marcus heard footsteps in the corridor outside. He extinguished his lamp and pressed himself against the wall behind the door, hand on his sword hilt. The steps paused outside the archive entrance, and Marcus held his breath, expecting to hear the sound of lockpicks or other tools. Instead, he heard a familiar voice, that of Sir Edmund Hartwell, the palace's elderly master of records. Sir Edmund was speaking to someone, discussing the arrangement of historical displays for the evening's festivities. Marcus relaxed slightly, but remained hidden. Even trusted officials might inadvertently reveal information to the wrong person. The guests will be particularly interested in seeing the crown jewels display, Sir Edmund was saying. Though of course, we'll be showing only replicas, as always during public events. Marcus's blood ran cold. If replicas were being displayed, where were the real crown jewels? Were they secure, or had they already been targeted by the conspiracy? He realized that his focus on the stolen items from Queen Isabella's personal collection might have blinded him to an even larger theft. After Sir Edmund and his companion moved on, Marcus slipped out of the archive and made his way toward the treasury vault where the crown jewels were normally housed. The route took him through sections of the palace he rarely visited, and he was struck by how many people he didn't recognize were moving through the corridors. Festival preparations always required additional temporary staff, but the sheer number of unfamiliar faces was concerning. The treasury vault was located beneath the main palace, accessible only through a heavily guarded stairway. But, when Marcus approached the guard station, he found it unmanned. This was unprecedented. The treasury was supposed to be under constant supervision, especially during events when the palace was filled with strangers. Marcus descended the stone steps, his footsteps echoing in the narrow passage. The vault door stood open, and inside he could see the duty guard slumped over his desk. For a moment, Marcus feared the man was dead, but a closer examination revealed he was merely unconscious, probably drugged. His breathing was steady, but he would likely remain insensible for several more hours. The treasury itself showed signs of systematic looting. The crown jewels were indeed missing, as were several other valuable artifacts. But this wasn't the random grabbing of a desperate thief. Items had been selected with expert knowledge, taking pieces that were both valuable and historically significant while leaving behind less important but more obvious treasures. Marcus found a detailed inventory list on the guard's desk, with certain items marked in what appeared to be a code. Cross-referencing with the empty displays, he realized that the markings corresponded exactly to the missing pieces. Someone with intimate knowledge of the treasury's contents had provided the thieves with a shopping list. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about Lady Camilla and Thomas Aldridge. There was a network of conspirators throughout the palace hierarchy, people with access to the most sensitive areas and information. The festival wasn't just providing cover for a single theft, it was the culmination of a systematic looting operation that had probably been in progress for months. Marcus heard voices approaching from above and quickly hid behind one of the empty display cases. Two men descended into the vault, speaking in hushed tones. One voice he recognized as belonging to Sir Geoffrey Blackwood, the palace's deputy treasurer. The other was unfamiliar, with an accent that suggested foreign origins. "The documentation is complete," Sir Geoffrey was saying. "The manifests show everything being transferred to the secure facility for cleaning and restoration. No one will expect to see the items again for several weeks." The foreign voice responded with satisfaction. "Excellent. By the time the deception is discovered, everything will be far beyond their reach. The buyer in Vienna is particularly eager for the Scepter of Ages." Marcus recognized the name. The Scepter of Ages was one of Valdoria's most sacred royal artifacts, used in the coronation of every monarch for the past 3 centuries. Its theft was not just a crime but a direct assault on the monarchy's legitimacy. The conversation continued, revealing the full scope of the conspiracy. Items were being systematically removed from the palace under the guise of routine maintenance or security transfers. False documentation was being created to cover the thefts, and the festival was serving as both distraction and deadline for the operation's completion. But Marcus also learned something that chilled him to the bone. This wasn't just about stealing artifacts. The conspirators were working for a consortium of European powers that wanted to destabilize Valdoria's government. The kingdom's strategic position made it valuable to various nations seeking to expand their influence, and weakening the monarchy was seen as the first step toward eventual annexation or partition. The two men concluded their business and departed, leaving Marcus alone with the empty vault and the magnitude of what he had discovered. This was treason on a scale that threatened the very existence of Valdoria as an independent nation. Marcus knew he had to act, but the challenge was overwhelming. He was one man against a conspiracy that involved multiple palace officials, foreign agents, and international political interests. Any direct confrontation would likely result in his death or disappearance, while the evidence he had gathered could be easily dismissed or destroyed. Instead, Marcus decided to use the conspirators' own methods against them. If they could create false documentation and use official channels to cover their crimes, he could potentially do the same to expose them. Making his way to the palace's administrative offices, Marcus used his authority as a senior guard to access record-keeping areas normally off-limits to security personnel. Working with practiced efficiency, he began documenting everything he had observed, creating a comprehensive record of the conspiracy that would be difficult to dismiss or suppress. He photographed inventory lists, copied suspicious documentation, and prepared detailed maps showing the locations of thefts and the routes used by the conspirators. Most importantly, he created multiple copies of everything, hiding them in different locations throughout the palace where they would eventually be found even if he didn't survive to present them himself. As the afternoon wore on and the festival preparations reached their crescendo, Marcus realized that his window for action was rapidly closing. The planned theft from the Crown Archive would happen during the evening's celebrations, and, once those documents were gone, the conspirators would have everything they needed to challenge the monarchy's legitimacy. Marcus made his final preparations, arming himself with weapons and evidence, and positioning himself to intercept the thieves when they made their move. He had decided that if he couldn't prevent the theft through official channels, he would stop it through direct action, regardless of the personal cost. As the sun began to set and the first guests arrived for the autumn festival, Marcus took his position in the shadows near the Crown Archive. The sounds of music and laughter drifted through the palace corridors, creating a surreal contrast to the deadly serious game of cat and mouse that was about to unfold. The conspirators would come for the documents tonight, expecting to find the archive undefended and the palace distracted by celebration. Instead, they would find Captain Marcus Thorne of the Royal Guard, standing alone between them and the destruction of everything he had sworn to protect. In the distance, church bells began to toll the evening hour, their bronze voices carrying across the ancient stones of the palace. Each note seemed to Marcus like a countdown to the final confrontation that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of the kingdom he served. The stage was set for a battle that would echo through Valdorian history, a fight between those who would preserve the crown's legacy and those who would destroy it for their own gain. As darkness fell over the palace and the festival reached its height, Marcus prepared to make his stand against forces that threatened to tear apart the very foundations of his homeland. The autumn festival would indeed be remembered in the annals of Valdorian history, but not for the reasons its organizers had intended. Tonight would mark either the salvation or the fall of a kingdom, decided by the actions of one loyal guard who refused to let treachery triumph over honor.